Hi, welcome to this HR seminar or webinar. It's great to see that so many have signed up. So this shows that it's a great interest to employers and yourself. As Nancy mentioned, my name is Annie Gleson. I work as an event manager for the Norwegian British Chamber of Commerce. This event is a collaboration between the Danish UK Association, the Finnish Chamber of Commerce, Norwegian Chamber, and of course then Goodwille, who are the speakers here today. This is all about the legislation updates, which comes into force every April, and it is very important that employers implement the changes so they are compliant with UK employment law. Let's see, who will be moving the slide here? Thank you. We are lucky to have the HR manager, Jacqui Brown, and senior HR advisor, Helen to talk about these topics to us today. And the topics are various employment law changes, changing pay, statutory pay, other pay maybe, look at equality, diversity and inclusion, which is a very important point. We have all heard about the menopause discussions going on, which is great. And we're also going to look at the neurodiversity. They will also look at a few case examples. As Nancy mentioned, there will be a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please pass on your questions in the Q&A and we will go through them then. So now it's just for me to hand over to Jacqui and all the best.
Thanks, Annie. I think we've got our next slide, haven't we? Thanks, Nancy. So a lot of you on this call will be familiar with who Goodwille are anyway, but for those who are not, Goodwille are a UK business who specialise in supporting small to medium-sized companies to enter, grow and scale in the UK. We supply a full suite of support services, which includes corporate governance, finance, HR, payroll and virtual office. If we can just move next slide, please. And of course, as Annie mentioned, there is the HR team here today, or some of. We support as a HR department the full employee life cycle. We can help with hiring both local employees in the UK and also bringing staff over from your headquarters, wherever they may be. And also, as Annie mentioned, I'm the HR manager at Goodwille. Helen is here too, who's a senior HR advisor in the team. Yeah, we've got lots to get through, so I'll stop waffling and hand over to Helen to tell you about some employment law changes.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I wanted to run through a number of pay changes that are happening in April at various different dates. So the first is the increase in the national minimum wage, which increases to £10.42 per hour from the 1st of April for 23 and overs. Then there's the increase to family leave pay, which takes effect from the 2nd of April, and that increases to £172.48 per week. There's also the increase to the statutory sick pay, which is in effect from the 6th of April, and that increases to £109.40 per week. And then finally, there's an increase to the statutory redundancy payments again, which are effective from the 6th of April. And that increases to £643 per week, with a cap increasing to £19,920 per annum as a cap. Next slide, please. So I'm also going to cover off a number of employment law changes that are happening. Some have already been considered and some that are coming up for the future for consideration. The first is that there's an extra bank holiday for the King's coronation on the 8th of May this year. And then I wanted to talk about the menopause and some of the employment law considerations that have been made on top of what we were going to talk about later on in the session. So in response to the Women and Equalities Commission report, menopause in the workplace, the government has committed to appointing a menopause employment champion to work with organisations to look at formulating menopause policies and to create an employment-led menopause in the workplace awareness campaign. However, they have rejected to start a menopause leave pilot programme and to introduce a dual protected characteristic of sex and age under the Equalities Act to help protect menopausal women at work. And they've also rejected to launch a consultation on making a menopause a protected characteristic for the Equalities Act. We will be covering more about menopause and menopause in the workplace later on in this session. The government has also launched a consultation on holidays and how they should be calculated for irregular and zero-hour contracts following the Supreme Court's decision for Harport Trust and Brazil and Unison in July 2022. The consultation for this has now closed, but currently we don't have a definite answer or any further update on this. But as soon as we hear on that, then we'll be letting our clients know. The government has also backed a bill giving all employees and workers, including agency and zero-hour workers, the right to formally request a more stable working pattern, subject to parliamentary approval. This will be reviewed from the 3rd of February this year. And workers will be able to request 2 of these per year, and employees will be able to refuse the requests on specific grounds, such as additional costs involved or the lack of work at the times that have been requested. There's also a draft code on firing and rehiring that was presented on the 24th of January this year. The government has published a draft statutory code of practice on the use of dismissal and re-engagement known as fire and rehire, as this means change of terms in employment contracts. The consultation on the new code closes on the 18th of April this year, and currently there's no indication yet on when it will be brought into force. There's also important dates coming up for gender pay gap reporting. So this is already live from the 30th of May 2022, and there's an important date of the 4th of April this year for private and voluntary sectors with employees of more than 250. The employment pay gap is a measurement of the difference between the average earnings of men and women across the workplace. Businesses are encouraged to provide and support narrative explaining the causes of any pay differences and an action plan on how they intend to address those issues. There's also a number of parliamentary bills that are being brought, the government have brought and that are looking to back. The first is on neonatal care, the leave and pay bill. So this will allow parents whose babies need hospital neonatal care to take 12 weeks paid leave in addition to their statutory maternity and paternity leave. There's also the Employment Allocation of Tips Bill, which will make it unlawful for employers to withhold tips from any staff. The next thing that I will cover is the Protection from Redundancy for Pregnancy and Family Leave Bill. So this will look at employees on maternity leave currently must be given priority for suitable alternative employment in redundancy situations for 18 months from taking the leave. There's also the Carers Leave Bill. So this looks at giving carers 1 week unpaid leave per year to care for a dependent with a long-term care need that is likely to last more than 3 months, is a disability under the Equalities Act 2010, or is connected to old age. There's also the Employment Relations Flexible Working Bill, and this looks at the request for flexible working from a day one right. So, and it also includes reducing the employer's time to reply to 2 months rather than 3 months. And now I'll hand back to Jacqui.
Thanks, Helen. That's quite a lot. I know there's loads of things in the pipeline, so we'll, as Helen said, we'll keep you posted as and when they actually become part of legislation, but we're quite confident that a bulk of them will soon. But talking about equality, diversity and inclusion, so we wanted to make this bit a bit more juicy and talk about some more topical issues that certainly have been on the HR and employment law agenda in the past year or so. Namely like menopause and neurodiversity. So we'll talk about all of that in a minute, but firstly, wanted to speak about equality, diversity and inclusion, or EDI as you may know it, and how this is all linked. So when we speak about EDI, many people might just think about gender, race, nationality. They are kind of the more common topics, but it's much more than this. So for those of you who are unaware, there are a number of protected characteristics which are showing on your screen now, included within the Equality Act 2010. If you're not familiar with that act and you are working with people, assume if you're on this webinar that you are, suggest that you do become familiar with it because it is pretty important. But the Equality Act covers 9 categories which are all considered protected under the law, meaning really that if we break it down, if someone is treated unfairly or differently in a negative way, then it's considered as discrimination and is unlawful, of course. So you have the 9 on your screen there. I'm not going to read them all out, but just for your awareness in terms of the topics of neurodiversity and menopause today, and they are more focused on the protected characteristic of disability when we think about discrimination. So the Equality Act outlines a person having a disability if either the person has a physical or the person has a physical or mental impairment, and the impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on the person's ability to carry out their normal day-to-day activities. So this is what we need to, that's the test effectively. So I'm going to hand off now to Helen to talk about the menopause.
Thanks, Jacqui. I'm going to cover off some information about the menopause and perimenopause. It's definitely a topic of discussion. There's more and more discussion in the media and within HR. There's been more employment tribunals that have been brought. So it's definitely a topic to be talking about, to be raising within your businesses, and to be having open discussions about. If I can have the points on the slide, thank you. So what is menopause and perimenopause, and what are the symptoms? So it can happen to women of any age. It's not just a woman of a particular age. There's a wide age range that it could be affected, and the symptoms may be some of these. They may be affecting individuals more so than others, and some women don't experience any symptoms at all. But things to bear in mind are changes in periods, mental health changes. That could include changes in mood, like low mood, anxiety, mood swings, low self-esteem, problems with memory or concentration or brain fog. It could include hot flushes, difficulty sleeping. Other physical symptoms might be that you might feel dizzy, you might have heart palpitations, so your heart's racing, headaches and muscle aches, and other body changes and skin changes as well. So you could have dry, itchy skin, you could have headaches, migraines, and other things, symptoms to consider. It is important to note at the moment that it's not a specific protected characteristic, as I talked about earlier in the considerations that the government has made, but it is important to think about it in a wider aspect in terms of it may be covered by the Equalities Act rather than a specific protected characteristic. And that it can affect every woman in a different way. So some women won't experience any symptoms at all, and some will have a range of symptoms that may come and go, or that may be there throughout the period of perimenopause or menopause. And Jacqui and I are going to talk about 2 cases that talk about the specifics in those cases and give 2 different examples. So I'll hand over to Jacqui.
Excuse me. So as
oh, sorry. We've already talked about the points that have been covered for the government's points, and that they've rejected to start a menopause leave pilot program, and that they've rejected to have it as a specific protected characteristic in the Equalities Act.
There we go. So as Helen mentioned, there are 2 cases that we are going to give you as an example, which have been in the tribunal recently. I'll kick off with the first, and that is McMahon and Rothwell, versus Rothwell and Evans LLP. In this particular example, the claimant worked as a typist in a law firm. She went off sick on a number of occasions for various reasons, which included childcare, optical issues, and also stomach problems, which on one occasion was confirmed by a doctor's fit note to be actually menopause. The claimant also sent an email to a partner at the firm telling him that she'd been diagnosed as menopausal and that her symptoms were, again, quite unbearable. She also linked her lateness to hot flushes because of her need to change clothing as a result of that. And the response that she received from her boss was that, you know, he thanked her for the information, but did express that she had shared a little bit too much information, but it does help us to be made aware of these problems. So a bit of background here, the claimant was working towards a conveyancing apprenticeship. She was given a role supporting a lead conveyancer who had gone part-time because they were preparing for retirement. The role itself was of critical importance to the company that she worked for. But an incident that happened was she was accidentally labelled as a PA in a job description. And she resigned as a result of that. When the company apologised for the error, she retracted her resignation and blamed her hasty decision-making on being menopausal, which can be one of the symptoms if we think about mood changes and so on. So she was allowed to retract her resignation. Now, with the company, there was no HR at the company, and when sick notes were sent in, they went straight to payroll. They weren't seen by anyone senior in the company, including her boss, but that was unbeknownst to the claimant. So when one of her fit notes from her GP said that the reason for sickness was stomach and gynecological, then the senior manager, her boss, didn't see it. And instead, when she completed her return to work form and when she was calling in sick, it was for reasons such as the flu and that she had aches and so on. So she wasn't telling her boss directly in this instance when she was sick what the reasons were. There was a concern apparently between the managers at work about her reliability. There have been some childcare issues, and because of this perception, she'd started to downplay her menopause symptoms. She did have another sickness relating to optical issues, which is a corneal ulcer. So for those of you who aren't aware, then this can be linked to a dryness issue, which can also be linked to the menopause. There were again more childcare issues, and it meant that she needed to take time out. So ultimately, she was eventually dismissed because of her dependability was immediately in question. And that included things like timekeeping problems, extended breaks, and absences. So she subsequently brought a claim. She alleged that the dismissal was discriminatory on the basis that she was disabled by virtue of her menopause symptoms and because she was a woman. And then the outcome of the tribunal was, it was accepted by the tribunal that the effect of her menopause symptoms were such that they did meet the definition of disability under the Equality Act. However, it argued, or it rejected, that the argument that those were the reasons underlying her dismissal. Instead, the tribunal upheld the company's argument that the dismissal was not discriminatory due to her disability, but it was due to her unreliability and alarming number of absences. The tribunal also found that the company did not have the requisite actual or constructive knowledge that the claimant was disabled to discriminate against her on that basis. They could also find no evidence that a male comparator would have been treated differently if they'd also taken time out to care for a child. Excuse me. So this case in particular is an important reminder that employers need to have a knowledge of a disability in order to be discriminatory against it. So that knowledge could be either actual, in that the employee has disclosed the issue in such a way for the employer to be aware that they have a disability, or it could be constructive, where the employee has disclosed symptoms that suggest that there is a significant effect on that person's day-to-day life. And if it's reasonably obvious that you should suspect that they have a disability. So of course we can't turn a blind eye if something is quite obvious and just say, oh, they've not told me that is an issue for them. If there is reasonable suspicion that someone has a disability, then you are deemed to know, and you have a duty of care to address the matter. But in this particular case, even though the ET did say she has a disability, because she downplayed her symptoms, that is a key part in this case. And that was what led to the tribunal's decision to decide that actually it wasn't a discriminatory dismissal. Helen, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about Rooney and the Leicestershire City Council case. So in this particular case, she was a childcare social worker, and she started with the council in August 2006. And in 2017, she started having menopausal symptoms. She started forgetting to attend events, meetings, appointments. She was losing personal possessions, forgetting to lock her car, forgetting to lock her house up when she left it. She was also experiencing dizziness and some joint pain. She also had several periods of sickness absence because of this and due to work-related stress. She felt that management hadn't managed her absences and that she was dealt with insensitively and heavy-handedly, and she resigned in 2018. She raised two separate employment claims, one for constructive dismissal and non-payment of holiday and overtime and reimbursement for expenses. And then when she appointed a new solicitor, they also claimed a second claim for disability and sex discrimination on the grounds of the menopause. Initially, the Employment Tribunal struck out the sex discrimination claim, but upon appeal, it was sent back to the Employment Tribunal, and the outcome is expected later this year. What kind of learning should we take from this particular case is that we should proactively consider ways to support employees going through the menopause. So that might be looking at their workspaces and making sure that they're appropriate, close to fans, air conditioning, windows and doors. They're kept away from heaters and can help make people feel more comfortable. Similarly, companies should consider flexible working arrangements. So is that looking at more frequent or longer rest periods, adapting dress codes, looking at hours of work. For example, Tesco's have recently announced their plans to revamp their staff uniforms and to introduce more breathable fabric for those suffering with hot flushes. Also, it's a really key point to talk about training for not just managers, but for the wider workforce, in order for everyone to have an understanding and to promote inclusivity and to everyone to have that knowledge. The Institute of Occupational Safety and Health are in favour of all these adjustments and have recently recommended and outlined additional benefits of tailoring workplace risk assessments specifically for individuals going through the menopause. And so doing this may then minimise any potential risks of unfair dismissals, constructive dismissals or discrimination cases going forward. Back over to Jacqui.
Excuse me. I think we've got our next slide, please, Nancy. Thanks. Okay, so our next focal point is neurodiversity, which is nice, as it was Neurodiversity Celebration Week just last week, seemingly. So if we think about neurodiversity and what we mean by that, the word comes from two parts, neurological and diversity. So neurological means things to do with our brain, and diversity means things that are different. It's a term used for lots of different people who have different thinking or communicating styles. That can include lots of different conditions. So autism and ADHD being the one that people most commonly think of, I guess. And it impacts how people communicate with others and the world around them. But there's also conditions such as dyslexia, which affects how people read and spell, or dyspraxia, which impacts your movement and coordination. So for some people, their neurodivergence can mean that they are they're better at some things than many other people. And then for others, additional support or adjustments might be required. Obviously, we need to bear that in mind when we think about neurodiversity in the workplace. It's estimated that around 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent, and that means that many businesses already have a neurodiverse workplace. So it's important that you ensure that you have an understanding of what neurodiversity is, and that also managers have developed the skills to lead and manage a neurodivergent team. And it's also important that reasonable adjustments are considered where they are possible to support and assist neurodivergent people within the workplace. Of course, we want to create an inclusive and friendly workplace for all, and that includes people who are neurodivergent. So as an employer, you have a duty of care, as we've touched on previously with the cases in the menopause. You have a duty of care towards your employees. That means being mindful of those differences, to have support systems available. And really, we will go on to this shortly, but using occupational health where possible as well to assess reasonable adjustments and training your staff to get the best out of them. As before, we've got a couple of cases to speak about, so I'm going to hand off to Helen to talk about the first one.
Well, I'm going to talk about Morgan and Buckinghamshire. So in this particular case, the claim wasn't upheld. So the claimant brought a claim against the company, and she was a supervising social worker, and they were responsible for the fostering team. And she was dismissed for giving gifts to a child for whom she was responsible without the authority of her manager. And because of this, it was considered to be inappropriate, and she was also making inappropriate comments on case notes that she had written. The Employment Tribunal found her to be disabled under the Equalities Act 2010 due to various conditions, including autism and dyslexia. It was, however, found that she had breached professional boundaries, and that the company could not be confident that this would not be repeated, therefore, that was the reason why she was dismissed. It's important to think about this case in that the company had lots of written processes and procedures in place in terms of if you were to give a gift to a child, what the process should be, and that this particular person hadn't followed those processes. It was also important to consider in this case that the claimant didn't always disclose their disability to the company until a later date, until they were going through a particular process. They didn't disclose it at the point of recruitment or at the early stages of their dismissal. So these particular cases should be treated, and situations should be approached really carefully. When deciding what kind of approach to take in these situations, where an individual relies on neurodivergence as an explanation, key factors will be how the neurodivergence and/or the medication that the employee is taking affects the employee, what the likelihood is of the behaviour to be repeated, if any reasonable adjustments would assist in reducing those risks. Jacqui's already mentioned it's a really key point to look at reasonable adjustments and how they could be implemented in the workplace, and if any other sanctions could be considered other than dismissal. And I'll hand over to Jacqui to talk about the second case.
Excuse me. Okay, so there was a recent case where an employment law specialist, of all people, won £168,000 for an unfair dismissal case. So that was a case of Aylett versus BPP, who are a law university, for those who are not aware. So Elizabeth Aylett was a university law lecturer. She successfully won her case for constructive unfair dismissal. Her background was that she suffered from anxiety and depression and was also diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder after leaving her job at BPP. She had repeatedly raised issues about her workload whilst working at BPP and her problems in being unable to cope with it. So she'd been a lecturer with them for 10 years, from 2009. She'd suffered from bouts of depression since 1990, which she had disclosed to the university. And whilst she was in employment, she again experienced depression and stress relating to a busy work life. And she was diagnosed with anxiety and depression shortly after, which she had told a colleague at BPP. At one point during her employment, a colleague had said she was a good worker, but as mad as a box of frogs. So disgraceful, really, isn't it? But she'd been working an average of 55 to 60 hours a week. She'd also cancelled planned holidays in order so that she could complete work objectives. She was drinking alcohol to help her cope with the work pressure. She then took a few days off, a sick leave, and told her work that her department was understaffed and that this had affected her health. She raised concerns to her work that she felt unable to say no, but again, nothing was being done about her workload. She told the HR manager at BPP about her issues, and the response to that was that someone of her age and experience should be able to prioritise and manage their workload. She also requested a referral to occupational health, but this was not done. Instead, the HR manager proposed a settlement agreement and a re-engagement as a contractor, which of course caused further anxiety at the thought of losing her job. She then raised a grievance alleging a failure to make reasonable adjustments, and she was finally referred to occupational health a significant amount of time after she'd initially asked for it. And from the occupational health report concluded that she did have a depressive illness, which amounted to a disability. So after that, the claimant then resigned. She filed a discrimination claim, followed by a second claim of constructive unfair dismissal. So the tribunal found that the university had failed to reduce her workload, unsurprisingly, despite her mental health issues, which had led to her leaving her post. I've already mentioned the payout, but the take-homes from this are that, first off, occupational health was clearly not engaged with the claimant early enough. It was found that she had clearly suffered a breakdown, but that her employer was completely dismissive of this and deemed this to be part of her perception of stress. The judge also commented that her boss was plainly of the view that managers working in excess of contractual hours was normal. And also that the university had knowledge of the claimant's depression and anxiety, excuse me, but they did find that she was not subject to less favourable treatment because of that disability, and therefore her discrimination claim against the university failed. But it was found again that that the university had failed to make reasonable adjustments, including reducing the claimant's workload and failure to provide her with additional support, which included that occupational health meeting. And also, that the grievance that had been carried out by HR had been superficial and inadequate. And ultimately that had been the last straw and had led to her resignation of her post. So effectively, all of those things there, you need to remember that you do have a legal duty of care to your employees to make reasonable adjustments where relevant. You have to be responsive where you are either suspicious that there is a disability or you have an outright knowledge that there is, and definitely use occupational health. Okay, I think we've got a next slide, please, Nancy. Oh, no, we don't, sorry. I'm a bit hasty.
That's great, Jacqui and Helen.
Yeah, we just wanted to cover a little bit about what you can do, taking the learning points from those cases, like what you can do to protect your company and staff, and some ideas that we had. I mean, obviously chip in where you like here, Helen, but we had thought about asking for when you make an offer to an employee, as an example, in your starter paperwork, be that offer letter or post offer, ask your employees to let you know if there is anything that you should be aware of, any disabilities, so that you can prepare and make those adjustments for when they start. Because trust me, it makes everyone's life a lot easier if you're aware up front. and then you don't sort of, you know, find out something pivotal a few months into someone's employment, and it's sort of all gone pear-shaped before that point. So that would be my 2 pence.
And I think it's also really important to have awareness throughout the workforce. So some training and an awareness throughout everyone who works within your companies, but also for line managers as well. So how increasing knowledge for neurodiversity and the menopause that we've spoken about specifically today across the business, and in particular for managers in terms of how they can support their employees, what to look out for, when to raise questions, and how to support your workforce and be there for them, so you're aware of what's happening and how to best manage that as well.
Yeah. If we think about that practical things of like things like equipment that's out there to support as well. You know, if you are engaging with your employees and they have disclosed, if they, you know, have something like dyslexia, you know, there are softwares out there that you can access to implement. There's also, I believe it's a government initiative, Access to Work as well. And they can help in terms of offering you guidance and support in advance of bringing a person in to work, or if you do excuse me, establish that someone if an employee has something going on that requires assistance, then, you know, you can obtain their expertise in terms of equipment and support and grants and so on. So that could be quite beneficial, particularly for smaller companies. Also, maybe like implementing some mental health first aiders at work. So there are a whole range of mental health first aid training providers out there that can, you know, you can get a couple of days courses, super helpful, and might just help your employees have an access point of someone that they maybe feel is more trustworthy to go and speak to about something that they feel is going on for them at any point. You might also want to implement some EDI champions, maybe, and, you know, particularly if you're more geographically spaced workforce, maybe that could help as well, as being sort of individuals who are going to champion difference, and that might give your employees the confidence to again have a person to go and speak to and feel like they have a voice in the organisation.
And I think what I've already touched on, and Jacqui's already mentioned throughout the call today, is about, you know, training, and the training isn't just delivered as a one-off, that it's just a tick box exercise that you've done it once, or when someone starts, that's the training that they undertake, that it's refreshed regularly, that it's good quality and it's up-to-date training that's delivered for your business. Most of the training that we experience now is done remotely because of the world of work now, but that could be on-site training or remote training, but it's not just as a part of a yes, we've done that and a tick box. It happens yearly, it's refreshed, it's updated, because if you don't have training in place, then there is a potential uplift in the if an employee does bring a claim and they are given an award, then there's a potential uplift if there's poor or no training put in place by your businesses.
Yeah, I mean, some forms of poor behaviour at work, which are linked to the protected characteristics. If you remember earlier in the session, there were the 9 protected characteristics under the Equality Act. So if there's poor behaviour linked to one of those characteristics, it could be considered harassment, which is something that the courts are very interested in. And if you have not done what you should have done to protect your staff from this kind of negative behaviour, which includes the training of good quality, which Helen has just mentioned, then there was some guidance produced by the Equality and Human Rights Committee that was under the government's Good Work Plan a couple of years back, which basically says this needs to be good quality training. You have an obligation to train your staff in these specific areas. If you don't, and then there's something that, you know, there's bullying and harassing behaviour which happens, then again, this leads to the lovely 25% uplift on whatever the employee is awarded at court. And I'm sure that's not what anyone would like, especially when there are unlimited fines actually for discrimination. So yeah, just something to bear in mind. But yeah, I think we're ready for any questions now, if anyone should have any.
Great, thank you, Jacqui and Helen. A lot of good information here and ideas as well on how to deal with certain things. Yes, we have questions coming in, and let's kick off with the first one, which is to do with neurodivergence. So we are aware many neurodivergent individuals feel reluctant to disclose their diagnosis to the employer. What can organizations do to encourage higher disclosure rates, celebrate differences, and make neurodivergent staff feel included and supported by the organizations, which is so important? Who would like to dive into that one?
I think some of what we've already talked about is really key in terms of celebrating differences within the business, having champions in the workplace to celebrate those differences, and to have someone that employees can go and talk to in confidence, or have that additional knowledge. Also to have the training across the business. The more we talk about these things, the more confident that people are in coming forward and talking about them. I think that's really key in supporting your employees and supporting your businesses. Jacqui, I don't know if you've got anything else to add in terms of anything the companies can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've just touched on it, Helen, really. So it's a mix of making sure that the theme when we are communicating about neurodiversity is a positive one, and that it's, you know, we celebrate differences, but we need to, of course, be sensible about it and think, how can we communicate better? How can we actually implement a workable solution that means that people are thriving at work rather than struggling, which may be the case if we don't make those reasonable adjustments. So I think that the tone of how we communicate is very important. And again, having those EDI champions and so on might go some way to help. But also the initial disclosures and just trying to encourage people to be honest about it. I know it's difficult, but it's better to say it sooner than later, right?
Good. A follow-up on this one, we have another one, which is also to do with when you give an offer in terms of disabilities. So it says, if an employer asks for information about disabilities in an offer letter, presumably they couldn't be reside the offer if the employee discloses a disability. Presumably that would constitute discrimination.
Exactly, yes. Yeah, so obviously when you ask for disclosure, then it is in the spirit of being an inclusive employer. Of course, I'm going to give a very extreme example here, but you know, if someone was being employed as a scaffolder and they had no legs, then of course that there's going to be, you know, that there needs to be a case of like, all right, can we actually make reasonable adjustments? Is it possible for the person to actually do the job? And then of course you would then speak to relevant occupational health or sort of support, just to try and understand whether the person was actually fit for the job that they're being employed to do. But presumably that would have been established from the interview process. But in the main, yes, of course, you wouldn't just if someone disclosed that they had a neurodiverse disclosure, then of course you couldn't just pull the offer.
Good. Let's see if we have some more here. Something about the dismissal and re-engagement. Are there any indications to what is included in the draft code for the hire and fire?
Not I think that's something that we will share the links to that at the moment, because it's going through it. The proposal has been submitted at the moment. I mean, the whole concept of it is that like basically you can't just redraft someone's contract, which is kind of like some risky in the first place, but risky practices that some companies were implementing was just to change someone's T's and C's. They would hire and rehire.
So I think this came about after P&O dismissed nearly 800 people last year, and then without any consultation. And as we can put together the details about what's being considered, and the code, the consultation closes on the 18th of April for that one.
Okay.
And then in regards to, it says about the menopause, what is it the employers need to do now in terms of policies? Do they need to be updated? Do they need policies in terms of menopause or neurodiversity? How does that go?
I mean, I guess it forms part of your equality and diversity and equal opportunities policies, really. It all sort of forms part of the whole package. Don't know, Helen, what are your thoughts on it? I personally don't feel like you need a specific menopause policy, but
no, I think you're right. I think it covers off what's already in existence in terms of ED&I policies and having inclusion. I think it's, we've focused on two particular points today, but I think it's important to celebrate differences and to celebrate those things across businesses, and to have those open discussions, because some people might not know, some people might have knowledge that's incorrect, or to celebrate the differences and to celebrate how you can support your employees is really important. Unless you're a larger organisation, I wouldn't suggest you need a separate policy. That could be covered in the policies that you've already got, but it's important to talk about it within your organisation, maybe have some specific training on those areas, and to celebrate the differences really across different people and across your workforce, and to have that open and inclusive environment so people can thrive and work well and have open communications with you and across the business as well.
Great. Then we have more questions coming in here. This is about menopause. So this is about a small for predominantly male employees. What can they do to be more educated on the topic? What can they do in the workplace?
I mean, first off, like, kudos to the company or person submitting the question, because I think that's just exactly the positive spirit that we want to encourage. But for sure, I mean, I think the obvious one to that would be to have the employees attend a training session on menopause, and it doesn't necessarily need to be what Helen and I have covered today. That's just like, danger, like, kind of like, this is what you need to do, like, these are all the things that could go wrong. I think just educating your staff and actually what the symptoms are, and to basically have some empathy that something could maybe be happening, and particularly on there have been a few other cases that obviously we haven't raised today that have been more around the brain fog part of the symptoms of menopause, and people being maybe treated unfavorably as a result of that, or being dismissed for reasons linked to that. And a lot of it maybe could be driven from naivety. Like, a lot of people do not understand what the symptoms of menopause are, and they maybe have the stereotypical view, as Helen mentioned earlier, of like a lady of a certain age, that it can only happen to them, and not actually realizing that it could actually be women who are decades younger than that perception who are going through the same symptoms, and so it's out of naivety that they maybe go a bit heavy-handed when someone's making errors at work or whatnot. So just educating the employees and so that they have a bit of empathy and maybe think twice before reacting.
Good. And then we have something about a health screening questionnaire. Is it risky to ask an employee to complete a health screening questionnaire?
So for this one, again, as I kind of touched on a little bit before about, when you can ask, if you're asking someone for disclosures, I guess this is kind of a similar ilk of question. A health screening questionnaire should only ever be completed when it's relevant for the job that they are going to be doing. So I suppose that reduces somewhat when when it would be appropriate. So if someone's going to just be going and sitting in a very sort of low risk job, that where they are just basically sitting at a laptop all day, and you know, they're not working with individuals who are, you know, excuse me, they're not working with certain categories of individuals, maybe they are just working with Joe Public, then it's not going to really be appropriate to ask them to complete a health screening questionnaire. So it really would depend on the job that they're doing as to whether that would be appropriate in the first instance.
Good. And I think we just ended with 2 questions, which is a little bit outside of what you have talked about, but it has been raised, so we can maybe touch on it. And one is about benefits. Is it now expected that employers always offer health and benefit like private medical health, or is that still not something you have to do?
It's not something you have to do. You know, it's not compulsory. It's not an obligation. I guess it's important to understand what's kind of common in your industry, though, and what sort of positions is someone working in. You know, what are your competitors doing as to whether it's going to be wise for you to offer something like that, so that you're attracting the best talent. But it's not mandatory to offer private medical insurance. At least for now, we still have the NHS. So, yeah.
Good. And then I think we ended, since we have a couple of minutes left, with this one. What changes should employers do for the employees with the rising cost of living in the UK? Is there any ideas or thought around that one?
I don't know who wants to take that one. It's a bit of a loaded.
I think it depends on some of it depends on what kind of industry you're in and on what kind of support that you can provide your employees, looking at where they work, how they work. You know, if you're looking at any kind of flexible working arrangements, you know, travel into offices, if there's any flexibility around that, or if it's, you know, a role that that has to be delivered from a particular site at a particular time. It's a really difficult one because, you know, even in the press this morning, there was information about inflation, and yeah, it's a difficult one for businesses to be able to support.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, of course, as we're all aware, like the inflation level's been mammoth, and it's maybe unrealistic to expect an employer to shoulder that burden for each and every employee, to give them a huge pay increase. But what some businesses have been doing as well is giving like periodical bonuses throughout the year to support cost of living. So you're not necessarily giving a huge salary bump up, but it's because, of course, we're all hoping at least that this will plateau at some point or reduce, and you don't then want a whole workforce of employees on very inflated salaries that are maybe not going to cut it again, like kind of in the next sort of couple of years. So that might be something that you could look at as well. And then also offering things like free breakfast in the office and those sorts of things, just some things that are like practical, like how can we help out our employees? If anyone's got any questions on it, then of course feel free to come back to Helen and I after the webinar, and we can give you some ideas, but maybe more than just brain dumping on you right now.
Oh, this is great. Thank you so much to you, Helen and Jacqui, and to all of you who have actually asked questions. We still have questions in the Q&A box, but we will actually get back to you. So Jacqui and Helen will pick up that after the event. And yes, if there's any other questions, be in touch with both of them. They will definitely be able to answer you. Thanks again to all the chambers who's been part of this, and not at least for Goodwille, and for all of you who actually signed up for this event. That's great. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.